There's nothing quite like the sound and look of a radial engine. Hello, and welcome to Model Airplane Maker. In this video, we will be looking at how to paint and finish radial engines for scale models. I'll show the various parts of the engine and what colors to use. Then I'll show you how I finish a kit engine in order to bring out its detail and really add to your model. Here we have a typical radial engine used on US aircraft, and you'll notice a few things. The paint scheme is relatively straightforward. It's a blue-gray on the crankcase and ignition ring, gloss black on the push rods, and aluminum on the cylinders. Now there are variations out there, and this is where pictures and references come in handy. For example, ignition rings can be silver, and wires can be black, and even a brown or almost khaki color. Here's a close-up of a variation. Notice at 1 that the ignition ring is no longer the blue-gray, it's more of a steel color, and the wires are that brown khaki color. And at 2, although the prop governor is black, the distributors are the blue-gray, matching the crankcase color. Turning to the back of the engine, we have 2 key components. The air intakes, which are almost always black, and the exhausts, which are usually faded to rust after any amount of use. I'll now demonstrate how I finish a kit engine. This is a typical kit radial engine on a 48th scale aircraft. This Hasegawa engine has a lot of molded on detail, but it is missing the ignition wires. To install them, I drilled holes in the ignition ring, and I used fine lead wire for the ignition wires. I use lead wire because it cooperates nicely when I bend it into place, and it takes paint well. As you can see, the engine crankcase and ignition ring are now painted. To replicate the colors of the R2800 engine, I used a mix of Tamiya medium blue and gray, and this will get it fairly close to the actual color. Now I'm starting with the details, and in this case I'm using a soft pencil. I believe it's an HB lead. I sharpen it using a 1500 grit paper, and all I'm trying to do is trace around the elevated detail, trying to get it as close to the detail as I possibly can. This can also be done using a wash. Now I'm going to add some shadows. I use a very thin mix of Tamiya's NATO Black, about 10% paint to 90% thinner, and I turn the pressure on the airbrush way down. What I'm trying to do is to trace the pencil lines that I drew in the previous step. This adds depth and will make subsequent highlighting on the engine really pop. My advice is to really take your time here. Because the color is thin, you can build up that color slowly, and I stop right when it becomes noticeable. Once the shadows are completed, we can get started on the highlights. And I begin with painting each one of the bolt heads. I'm using either a 00 or 000 brush, and I'm very carefully using Tamiya matte aluminum paint. All I'm doing is just slightly touching each one of the bolt heads to get a small bit of silver paint on them. Continuing on with the highlights, I want to use a lighter version of the base paint to highlight the raised details of the engine. Again, I'm using a small brush, and I'm using a mix of the medium blue and gray mix with a little bit of white. And what I'm trying to do here is pick out all of the raised details carefully. Onto the cylinders now. All we need to do here is use a wash. In this case, I'm using the Tamiya black panel line washer. And I'm just bringing out the details of the cooling vanes in all of the cylinders. And the next thing I do on this part is to apply gloss black on all of the push rods. Before installing the crankcase onto the cylinders, I'm using NATO Black by Tamiya to paint each one of the ignition wires. This paint is flexible enough to not flake off as you bend the wires into the cylinders. Once I glue the crankcase to the cylinders, I'm pretty much at the end. All it's left to do is to cut the wires to the correct size and fit them into the spark plugs at the front and in the back of the engine. In this case, I've drilled them out. After that, all that is needed is a flat coat on the crankcase, and it's done. So this is how I paint and finish a radial engine out of the box, using nothing more than a little lead wire and some paint. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.